Ethan Carter had always been a man of routine. He arrived at the construction site before anyone else, took his usual walk around to inspect the progress, and stayed until the last piece of equipment had been shut down for the day. It wasn't just about the job, it was about having something to focus on. Something to anchor himself to after everything he had lost. The hum of heavy machinery. The sharp clang of metal against metal. The scent of wet concrete. These things had become familiar, predictable, but on this particular morning, something felt different. Over the roar of engines and the distant chatter of workers, a faint sound reached his ears. It was barely noticeable, almost lost in the noise. But Ethan had spent too many years learning how to pick up on the small things, the warning creak of an unstable beam, the subtle shift in the ground before it gave way. He stopped in his tracks, listening more carefully. A soft, weak whimper. It was coming from the excavation pit. Frowning, he walked toward the edge, scanning the muddy ground below. At first, he didn't see anything, but then, just near the base of the pit, a small, trembling figure caught his eye. A dog, thin, covered in mud, its fur matted and clumped with dirt. It was half submerged in the thick, wet sludge, struggling weakly but too exhausted to free itself. Ethan's jaw tightened. The poor thing must have fallen in during the night, maybe looking for food, and with the heavy rains softening the ground, it had been trapped ever since. It wouldn't last much longer. Without hesitation, he turned and shouted toward the crew. "Shut it down! Shut everything down!" His voice cut through the noise. And within seconds, the machines rumbled to a halt, leaving only the sound of the wind whipping through the skeletal framework of the unfinished building. "What's going on, boss?" one of the workers asked as he jogged over. Ethan was already grabbing a coil of rope from the equipment pile. "There's a dog trapped in the pit," he said, tying a loop around his waist. "I'm going down." "You sure about that? That mud's deep. If you get stuck." "I won't." Ethan cut him off. "But that dog won't make it if we don't move now." Without waiting for more discussion, he tossed the other end of the rope to the worker and carefully climbed down, his boots sinking into the soft, slippery earth. The moment he got close enough, he saw the dog's dull, frightened eyes lock onto him. It didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared at him with a weary kind of acceptance, as if it had already resigned itself to whatever fate awaited. "Easy there," Ethan murmured as he took slow, careful steps through the thick mud. "We're getting you out of here." The dog flinched as he reached out, but it was too weak to resist. He worked quickly, wrapping a length of rope around its frail body, securing it snugly but gently. "All right, I got you," he said, giving the signal to the crew above. "Pull us up." The rope tightened, and Ethan pushed against the mud with his free arm, lifting the dog as they were hoisted upward. It took effort, the weight of the sludge dragging him down, but finally, they reached solid ground. The moment they were clear, Ethan collapsed onto his knees, breath coming hard, the dog still pressed against his chest. Now that they were both out, he could get a better look at it. It was small, not quite a puppy but not full-grown either. Its fur was a mottled brown and gray. though it was hard to tell with all the mud caked onto it. Ribs stuck out beneath the thin coat, and its paws trembled violently from exhaustion and cold. "Looks like a stray," one of the workers commented, standing nearby. "Poor thing." Ethan nodded, running a careful hand over the dog's head. "Yeah," he murmured, "poor thing." The dog's eyes drooped, its body slumping against him. But it was still breathing. Still fighting. That was something. Ethan stood, cradling the animal carefully. "I'm taking it to the shelter," he announced. "Get the site back up and running." "You sure you don't need us to take it for you?" another worker asked. Ethan shook his head. "No, I got this." He carried the dog to his truck, wrapping it in an old flannel shirt he kept in the back seat. As he started the engine, he glanced down, watching as the dog's tired eyes flickered open for just a moment. "You're all right now," he muttered. "You're safe." The shelter was a small, no-frills place on the outskirts of town, run by a few dedicated volunteers who did their best with limited resources. When Ethan walked in, the woman at the front desk looked up in surprise. "Well, this is new," she said, eyes flicking to the muddy bundle in his arms. "Found him stuck in a construction pit," Ethan explained. "Think you can help?" The woman nodded immediately. "Of course. We'll get him checked out, cleaned up, and fed." Ethan hesitated for a moment before carefully handing the dog over. "Take good care of him." She smiled. "We will." As he turned to leave, a small whimper made him pause. He glanced back, and for the first time, the dog lifted its head slightly, its eyes searching for him. It was brief, just a flicker of recognition, but something in that look made Ethan's chest tighten. He nodded once, as if making a silent promise, then walked out the door. Back at the construction site, everything had returned to normal. The machines roared back to life. Workers moved in synchronized rhythm, the steady progress of the job continuing as if nothing had happened. But for Ethan, something felt different. He couldn't shake the image of that dog, small and helpless, alone in the mud. That night, as he sat in his truck outside his house, he found himself staring at the shelter's number on his phone. He had done his part. The dog was safe now. He didn't need to do anything more. And yet, after a long moment, he exhaled, ran a hand through his hair, and dialed. Because maybe, just maybe, neither of them had to be alone anymore. The shelter smelled of antiseptic and fresh hay, the unmistakable scent of a place where animals came to heal. Ethan stepped inside, the small bell over the door chiming softly as he entered. He wasn't sure why he felt so tense. Maybe it was because this was unfamiliar territory. He could handle construction sites, heavy machinery, and long hours of grueling work. But walking into a place filled with hopeful, waiting eyes was something else entirely. Behind the front desk, a young man with tousled blonde hair looked up and grinned. "Hey there, you must be the guy who brought in the little mud-covered stray." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, any news?" The young man, whose name tag read Jamie, leaned against the counter. "Scout, well, that's what we've been calling him, is doing all right. You got him here just in time. He was pretty dehydrated, and he's underweight." but no broken bones or major injuries. Dr. Bennett can tell you more. She's in the back." Ethan glanced toward the hallway beyond the counter. "Can I see him?" Jamie nodded. "Follow me." They walked past a row of kennels, some occupied by dogs curled up on soft blankets, others empty but waiting. At the end of the hall was a small exam room where a woman in a crisp white coat was carefully checking Scout's paws. The dog was no longer covered in mud, and though he was still thin, his fur, now a warm, earthy brown, looked cleaner, softer. Dr. Olivia Bennett looked up as they entered, giving Ethan a professional but warm smile. "You must be Ethan." "That's me," he said, his gaze shifting to Scout. The dog perked up the moment he saw him, tail wagging hesitantly. Olivia set her stethoscope aside. "Scout is lucky. If you hadn't found him, he probably wouldn't have lasted much longer. He was severely dehydrated and malnourished. But there's no lasting damage. With proper care, he'll make a full recovery." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Good to hear." Olivia studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You know, he's been pretty quiet since he got here. But the second he heard your voice, he perked right up." Ethan glanced at Scout, who was watching him with those same tired but hopeful eyes. The dog took a cautious step forward, his tail wagging just a little faster. Jamie grinned. "Looks like someone's got a favorite." Ethan shifted his weight, unsure how to respond. "I just wanted to check in." "Of course," Olivia said, though something in her expression told him she saw more than he was willing to admit. "Would you like to stay while we finish up here?" Ethan hesitated but then nodded. He wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else. That first visit turned into a second, then a third. At first, he told himself he was just making sure Scout was recovering. He had found the dog. After all, it made sense to follow up. But as the days stretched into weeks, Ethan realized he wasn't just stopping by out of obligation. Each time he visited, Scout greeted him the same way, ears perked, tail wagging, eyes bright with recognition. The dog wasn't just getting stronger, he was coming back to life. Jamie would always be the first to comment. "Man, I swear he only gets this excited when you're around." Olivia, ever observant, took it a step further. One evening, as Ethan sat on the floor of the playroom, absent-mindedly scratching behind Scout's ears while the dog dozed against his leg, she leaned against the doorway and crossed her arms. "You know," she said casually, "we've had a few people express interest in adopting him." Ethan stiffened, his fingers stilling for just a moment before he forced himself to relax. "Yeah," she nodded, "but none of them are his person." Ethan frowned, looking down at Scout. The dog, as if sensing his gaze, shifted closer, sighing contentedly. Olivia gave him a knowing smile. "I think you already know who that is." Ethan let out a slow breath. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this." Olivia tilted her head. "Why not? I've never had a dog before," he admitted. "I wouldn't know what to do with one." Jamie, who had overheard from the hallway, laughed. "Buddy, you already do. You show up, you sit with him, you talk to him. You're doing more than half the dog owners I know." Ethan shook his head. It's different when you actually own one. It's a commitment. Yeah, Olivia agreed. But sir, is anything worth having? Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't sure he had an answer. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about it. His house was quiet, just like always. Too quiet, maybe. The kind of quiet that had once felt like solitude but now felt like something closer to loneliness. The next day, when he arrived at the shelter, he didn't hesitate when Jamie greeted him with, "Here to see Scout again?" "Yeah," Ethan said. Then, after a pause, "And maybe talk about taking him home," Jamie whooped, clapping him on the back. About time. When Ethan stepped into the playroom, Scout was already on his feet, tail wagging frantically, his entire body vibrating with excitement. Ethan crouched down, letting the dog press his face against his chest. He let out a chuckle, ruffling the fur behind Scout's ears. "Looks like you made up my mind for me." Scout licked his chin in response. Olivia appeared in the doorway, adoption papers in hand. "I think you just found yourself a best friend." Ethan looked down at Scout and, for the first time in a long time, felt something settle inside him. Something solid. Something real. "Yeah," he said, signing his name. "I think I did." Ethan Carter had always been a man who understood the importance of letting go. His life had been shaped by it, letting go of dreams that never came to pass. People who had walked away, and things he could never change. It was something he had learned to accept. But for the first time in a long while, letting go felt impossible. Scout had become a part of his days in ways Ethan hadn't realized until the possibility of losing him became real. At first, it had been just visits, checking in, making sure the little dog was recovering, sitting with him in the quiet moments between shelter duties. But somewhere along the way, those visits had turned into something more. Scout had gone from being just a stray Ethan had saved to something steady, something certain. And now, the shelter was ready to find him a home. Olivia had pulled him aside one afternoon, her expression gentle but firm. "We've had a family apply to adopt Scout," she told him. "A good family. They've got a big yard, 2 kids. And another rescue dog. I think he'll be happy there." Ethan had expected this. He had known, from the moment he brought Scout to the shelter, that this was how it would end. But knowing it and accepting it were two different things. "That's great," he said, his voice even, controlled. Olivia studied him, and he knew she saw past the calm mask he was trying to wear. "They'd like to meet him tomorrow," she said carefully. "You're welcome to be there." Ethan hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, I'll be there." That night, he sat in his quiet house, staring at the spot near the couch where Scout had curled up during the times Ethan had been allowed to take him out of the shelter for short visits. The house had always been quiet, but lately, it had felt less empty. Now, the thought of losing that small, steady presence made the walls feel too big, the silence too heavy. He shook the feeling off. Scout deserved a home, a real one, not just a man who had spent years convincing himself that being alone was easier. The next day, he arrived at the shelter just as the family was pulling in. A couple in their late 30s stepped out, followed by 2 young children, a boy who looked to be around 10 and a little girl who couldn't have been older than 6. Their other dog, a friendly-looking golden retriever, wagged its tail excitedly. When Scout was brought out, Ethan braced himself. He expected hesitation, nervousness, but instead, Scout's ears perked up with curiosity. And when the kids knelt down, holding their hands out patiently, Scout sniffed at them, his tail giving an uncertain wag before it picked up speed. Ethan swallowed hard. The little girl giggled. "He's so soft," she exclaimed, scratching behind Scout's ears. The boy grinned. "Can he play with Max?" he asked, gesturing to the golden retriever. Olivia nodded, stepping back to give them space. "Let's see how they do." Ethan watched, his chest tight, as Scout hesitated for only a second before following the children out into the shelter's fenced-in yard. Max bounded forward, inviting play, and after a moment, Scout responded, running alongside him, tail wagging, ears flopping with every step. The couple stood beside Ethan, watching their children laugh and play with the little dog he had saved from the mud. "He's perfect," the woman murmured. Ethan forced a nod. "Yeah, he is. He should have left then. It would have been easier." But his feet stayed rooted to the ground as Scout ran. Chased, barked, a happy, free sound that Ethan had never heard before. And then, after what felt like forever, Scout stopped. He turned, scanning the yard, and when his eyes landed on Ethan, he sprinted toward him without hesitation. Ethan knelt just in time for Scout to press his small, warm body against his chest. He ran a hand over the dog's fur, steadying himself. "You're gonna be happy here," he murmured. Scout wagged his tail but whined softly, pressing closer. Ethan exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He had done his part. He had saved Scout when no one else had been there to do it. He had given him time to heal. But this family, this home, this was what Scout deserved. He stood, looking at the couple. "He's yours." The woman smiled, her eyes kind. "Thank you, for saving him, for taking care of him." Ethan nodded but didn't trust himself to speak. Scout watched him as the family loaded him into their car, his tail wagging but his eyes still searching for reassurance. Ethan gave him one last nod, one last silent promise, and then they were gone. Ethan didn't go straight home. Instead, he drove for a while, taking roads he didn't usually take, letting the quiet hum of the truck fill the empty space inside him. He had done the right thing. He knew that, but knowing didn't make it hurt any less. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the silence of the house wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. No sound of paws on the floor. No eager, wagging tail waiting by the door. Just stillness. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Carter felt truly alone. But as he stood in the doorway, he let out a slow breath. Letting go was never easy. But maybe, just maybe, it meant there was still room for something else, something he hadn't found yet. Maybe, one day, he wouldn't come home to an empty house. Maybe, one day, he wouldn't have to let go. But for now, he did, because it was the right thing. And that had to be enough. The nights had grown colder since Scout had left. But Ethan had done his best to ignore the emptiness that settled in his house. The first few days had been the hardest, walking through his front door and instinctively expecting to hear the soft click of paws on the floor, only to be met with silence. He had kept himself busy, throwing himself into work, coming home late, and pretending the quiet didn't bother him. But no matter how much he tried, there were moments when it hit him, like when he absent-mindedly reached for an extra plate at dinner, or when he heard a dog barking outside and felt a flicker of hope before reality settled in. Scout was gone, and Ethan had made peace with it. Or at least, that's what he told himself. That night, after another long day at the construction site, Ethan was driving home, the hum of the truck engine the only sound in the stillness. It was late, and the roads were nearly empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. His mind was already drifting to a warm shower and sleep when something caught his eye, a small, moving shape on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was just another stray. This part of town wasn't unfamiliar with lost animals, and he had learned to look the other way, knowing there was only so much he could do. But as he slowed the truck, something about the way the figure moved, the hesitant but determined gait, made his heart lurch in his chest. He pulled over, his headlights illuminating the dark road ahead. And then, the shape turned toward him. Scout. For a moment, Ethan thought he was seeing things. But then the dog bolted toward him, tail wagging wildly, ears perked, and eyes full of recognition. The second Ethan stepped out of the truck, Scout leaped up, pressing his front paws against his legs, whining and licking at his hands as if trying to say, "I found you. I found my way back." Ethan dropped to one knee, hands burying into the familiar, slightly scruffy fur. "You found your way back, didn't you?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but Scout responded by pressing his face into Ethan's chest, his whole body trembling with excitement. For a long moment, Ethan just held onto him, feeling the warmth, the life, the undeniable sense that this was where Scout had always belonged. He pulled out his phone with his free hand, quickly dialing Olivia's number. It was late, but she picked up on the third ring, her voice groggy. "Ethan, everything okay?" Ethan exhaled, still running a hand over Scout's head. "I think you should tell Scout's new family to check their yard," he said. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Olivia spoke again. More alert this time. "He's with you?" "Yeah." Ethan looked down at the dog, who had settled at his feet, tail still thumping against the ground. "Found him just outside of town." There was another silence, then a sigh. "They called this morning," Olivia admitted. "Said he'd been missing for 2 days. We figured he might have gotten spooked and run off." Ethan frowned, looking at the small, worn pads of Scout's paws. "No," he said softly. "He didn't run off. He was looking for me." Olivia hesitated, then said, "Ethan, I think you already know what needs to happen." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the truth settle over him. He had spent months convincing himself that letting Scout go had been the right decision, that the little dog deserved a home filled with laughter and warmth. with children who would run through the yard with him and a family that could give him everything Ethan wasn't sure he could. But Scout had made his choice. Ethan exhaled and looked down at the dog who had somehow found his way across miles of unfamiliar roads, through cold nights and empty streets, just to get back to him. "I'm keeping him," Ethan said, the words coming out steady. "Sure." Olivia's voice softened. "I think that's the right call." Ethan glanced up at the stars, the crisp air filling his lungs. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something settle inside him. Scout hadn't given up on him. And maybe, just maybe, he shouldn't give up on himself either. He hung up the phone and looked back down at Scout. "Come on, buddy," he murmured, opening the truck door. "Let's go home." And this time, he knew it was for good. The adoption papers sat on Ethan's kitchen table for 2 days before he finally picked up a pen. It wasn't hesitation that kept him from signing. It was something else. Something deeper. He had spent so many years convinced that some people were just meant to be alone. That the idea of having something permanent, something that truly belonged to him, felt almost too good to be real. But Scout had changed that. The little dog had found his way back against all odds, crossing miles of unfamiliar ground to return to Ethan, to the only place he seemed to believe was home. And now, Ethan knew the truth. Scout had been right all along. With a slow, steady breath, he signed his name at the bottom of the form. Ethan Carter, owner. The words felt strange, but not wrong. When he looked up, Scout was sitting by his chair, ears perked, tail wagging just slightly, as if he understood that something important had just happened. "Well," Ethan murmured, setting the pen down and scratching behind Scout's ears. "Looks like you're stuck with me, buddy." Scout wagged his tail harder, pressing against Ethan's leg in quiet agreement. From that moment on, things were different. The house that had once felt too empty, too quiet, now felt alive in a way Ethan hadn't even realized he needed. Mornings were filled with the sound of paws against hardwood as Scout trotted around the kitchen, waiting for breakfast. Afternoons meant long walks through the fields behind the house, the little dog bounding ahead, pausing only to look back and make sure Ethan was still following. Evenings were spent on the porch, the two of them sitting side by side, watching the sun dip below the trees in companionable silence. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't mind coming home at the end of the day. One afternoon, Olivia and Jamie stopped by to see how things were going. Olivia had been the one to file the adoption paperwork, and Jamie had insisted they check in, though Ethan suspected they had more faith in him than he had in himself. When they pulled up, Scout bolted across the yard, his tail a blur of excitement as he greeted them like old friends. Jamie laughed, bending down to ruffle Scout's fur. "Well, looks like someone's settling in just fine." Olivia smiled as she watched Scout race around the yard, pausing only to glance back at Ethan, as if making sure he was still there. "I think he always knew where he belonged," she said softly. Ethan crossed his arms, watching the dog that had once been so frail, so uncertain, now running full speed with the kind of joy that couldn't be contained. He exhaled, feeling something loosen in his chest. "Yeah, he admitted. "I think so too." They spent the afternoon sitting on the porch, watching Scout chase after a worn-out tennis ball Jamie had found in his truck. Conversation was easy, filled with the kind of warmth that had been missing from Ethan's life for too long. "You ever think about getting him a friend?" Jamie asked, tossing the ball again. Ethan raised a brow. "I think one dog finding his way back to me is about all the fate I can handle." Jamie grinned. "Fair enough." As the sun dipped lower, Olivia and Jamie said their goodbyes, promising to visit again soon. Ethan stood on the porch, watching their car disappear down the road, then turned his gaze back to Scout, who had finally tired himself out and was now sprawled on the wooden planks, his head resting against Ethan's boot. The sky was painted in hues of orange and gold, the kind of sunset that made everything feel still, like the world was holding its breath. Ethan reached down, running a hand over Scout's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "I thought I was saving you," Ethan murmured, his voice low, almost lost in the breeze. "But maybe you saved me too." Scout's tail thumped lazily against the porch. He didn't move, didn't need to. Instead, he let out a soft sigh, his head pressing just a little closer to Ethan's leg, a silent answer. An unspoken understanding. Home. For both of them.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.